Welcome, and thank you for attending today's training related to multiple property documents in Oregon. Today's training is intended to provide cultural resource consultants with an overview of MPDs, how they can be used to streamline evaluations of National Register eligibility or as mitigation, and how to use an MPD to prepare an associated National Register nomination. Consultants who will find this training most useful include those who are experts in archaeology, historic preservation, and cultural resource planning and management, and are those who provide a range of professional and technical services related to the identification, documentation, evaluation, and management of cultural and archaeological resources. With that in mind, here is our agenda for the training. We'll begin with introductions. After that, we'll outline the intended objectives for this training for consultants. We'll then provide a discussion of what exactly MPDs are and how they work in the National Register of Historic Places. This will be followed by an overview of MPDs that currently exist in Oregon with a focus on a few examples. We'll then discuss in what instances a consultant might want to consider recommending a historic context, district nomination, or the creation of an MPD. That will then lead into a discussion on how to use an MPD form to prepare an associated nomination. This training is hosted by the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office, part of Oregon Heritage, which is housed within the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. The work of the Oregon SHPO can be divided into 5 categories: project review and compliance, document and find, designate, engage and advocate, and preserve. In accordance with state and federal laws, the Oregon SHPO provides project review and compliance to determine if a project will have impacts on properties of historic significance. This consultation process includes working with federal, state, and local agencies, and even private landowners to assess impacts on prehistoric or historic districts, sites, buildings, structures, objects, artifacts, records, material remains, and traditional, religious, spiritual, storied, or legendary places. Under Document and Find, the SHPO manages survey and inventory work in the state and maintains the state's historic sites database. With Designate, the SHPO reviews and assists with nominations to the National Register of Historic Places and manages Oregon Main Street, historic cemeteries, Oregon Heritage Traditions, and certified local government programs. With Engage and Advocate, the SHPO provides workshops like this training, as well as conferences, and commissions studies and reports and statewide plans. And under Preserve, the SHPO manages grant programs, administers tax incentive programs, and serves as a technical resource for preservation. This training is led by 2 consultants, Katie Pratt of Northwest Vernacular and Sarah Martin of SJM Cultural Resource Services. I am Katie, and I have worked as a historic preservation consultant in the Pacific Northwest since 2009 and am a graduate of the University of Oregon's Historic Preservation Program. My colleague Sarah is a former National Register Coordinator for the Kansas State Historic Preservation Office and has been a consultant in the Pacific Northwest since 2015.
As we've mentioned, this training is specifically for cultural resource consultants working in Oregon. We hope you walk away with a clear understanding of MPDs, what they look like, how they're used, and how they can be helpful beyond the scope of the National Register program. Second, you will have a greater awareness of the number and variety of MPDs in Oregon, as well as an understanding of what MPDs are available and how to use them. Many of you are familiar with the typical process of nominating a property or historic district to the National Register of Historic Places through the completion of a National Register nomination form. We'll cover this in more depth shortly, but in that nomination form, the preparer must establish the property or district's significance within its historic context. This can encompass multiple historical and architectural themes, making for a long and time-intensive document. The MPD, however, offers a different way to nominate properties that ultimately reduces the amount of documentation needed for each nomination. How so? Well, the MPD form serves as a sort of cover document to collect information on related properties and to evaluate the National Register eligibility of those related properties. Then, individual National Register nominations with the necessary property specific research are completed using the context and evaluation framework in the MPD. MPDs can be used over and over again to nominate related properties, not just at the time the MPD is submitted. An MPD form takes a group of related properties, like historic lighthouses or historic bridges, across a particular geographic area and identifies common themes, trends, and patterns of histories for that group of properties. An MPD's geographic scope can be limited to a single neighborhood or community, or can cover a broad geographic range. Ultimately, an MPD provides the framework for either the simultaneous or future listings of related properties. Lastly, it's important to highlight the differences between historic districts and MPDs and that they're not interchangeable. Historic districts are typically defined by a contiguous boundary that encircles a concentration of resources that are linked historically or aesthetically, like, for example, a downtown or a neighborhood. Resources within historic districts are significant as part of the district's collection of resources and may not be individually eligible for the National Register. However, properties nominated as part of an MPD must be individually eligible for the National Register, as outlined by the MPD's registration requirements. The properties must be able to stand on their own. Further, properties nominated as part of an MPD are not required to be geographically linked. For example, a post office in Bend and a school in Salem can both be nominated under the Oregon New Deal resources from the PWA and WPA, provided they meet that MPD's registration requirements.
Now that we've briefly discussed what a multiple property document, or MPD, is, we thought we'd provide a brief overview or reminder of the National Register of Historic Places, what it is, and how properties qualify for designation or listing. In the case of local, state, and federal agency clients, the National Register is important to understand because its criteria for evaluation and eligibility requirements are what are used when assessing whether properties impacted by projects have historic significance. The National Register is our nation's list of historically significant properties, specifically sites, structures, objects, buildings, and districts. In order to be eligible for listing, properties must meet certain age, significance, and integrity requirements. First, a property must be at least 50 years of age or have exceptional documented significance. Then it must be historically significant. And finally, it must retain enough physical integrity to convey that historical significance. In assessing whether a property or resource has historic significance, the National Register provides 4 criteria for evaluation: A, B, C, and D. Some properties may be significant under more than one criterion. Properties are significant under criterion A if they are associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. Properties are significant under criterion B if they are associated with the lives of persons significant in our past. Properties are significant under criterion C if they fit one or more of these descriptions: that they embody the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, that they represent the work of a master, they possess high artistic values, they represent a significant and distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction. Properties are significant under criterion D if they have yielded, or may be likely to yield, information important in prehistory or history. So with all that in mind, what content is contained in an MPD? An MPD form contains similar information as a National Register nomination. We will go over each section later on in this presentation, but the MPD form basically has 3 additional components than a typical National Register nomination form: associated historic contexts, associated property types, and registration requirements. Associated historic context is similar to the Statement of Significance section in a National Register nomination, but specifically outlines a historical theme, geographical area covered by the MPD, and a chronological period. The historic context, as there may be more than one included within an MPD, establish the framework within which to understand associated properties. While it may reference specific people or properties, the context must be general enough to apply to all the associated properties. Associated property types provide categories of properties that are eligible within the associated historic context. There may be one or more associated property types within the MPD. For example, the Craftsman Bungalows in Deschutes County MPD only relates to residential single-family properties, but it does outline the varying Craftsman Bungalow forms. The Associated Property Types section describes the physical characteristics and associative qualities of each type. Registration requirements define the standards and requirements for nominating a property that falls into one of the associated property types. If a property meets an MPD's registration requirements, then it is eligible for listing in the National Register under that MPD. In this way, MPDs help map the path toward designation for their associated property types. MPDs with clear registration requirements provide guidance for evaluating associated property types within the context of the National Register's criteria for evaluation. Now that we have a baseline on MPDs and the National Register of Historic Places, let's talk about MPDs specifically in Oregon. There are 54 MPDs in Oregon, including multi-state MPDs that include Oregon, which is higher than the national average of 45 per state and the median of 40. These MPDs vary in geographic scope and types of resources. The Oregon SHPO maintains a list of them, but they are also available through their Historic Sites database, along with other surveys, under group name. When a search is conducted for an MPD, the database will pull up the MPD form and any individual nominations associated with that MPD. Properties may be listed under one or more MPDs. MPDs have been developed for a number of reasons in Oregon and elsewhere in the country, and the use of MPDs, both in the creation of the initial MPD form and the subsequent associated listings, reflect this range of reasons. The earliest completed MPD in Oregon is the Oregon Covered Bridges from 1979, which lists 40 properties. A bridge has been listed under this MPD as recently as 2013. The Native American Archaeological Sites of the Oregon Coast MPS from 1997 has the most properties listed under it with 96. While this archaeological multiple property submission has not been used since its initial listing, it represents a decade of archaeological investigation and is the MPD in the state with the greatest number of associated listings. It also represents one successful way to use the MPD form: establish the historic context, associated property types, and registration requirements to list all identified properties in one fell swoop. Ultimately, MPDs in Oregon cover a range of property types, from archaeological sites, cemeteries, and landscapes to residential and commercial neighborhoods, lighthouses, Forest Service buildings, barns, bridges, social halls and other areas of social and civic gathering, and even irrigation and mining projects. On the next slide, we'll provide instructions on how to access the Historic Sites database, where it is on the SHPO website, and how to find MPDs in the database. This video shows in real time how to navigate the Oregon SHPO website to find the Oregon Historic Sites database. To start, go to the Oregon Heritage homepage, the landing page for the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office. The website is oregon.gov/oprd/oh/ or else you can utilize a search engine and look for Oregon SHPO, and this website should be the first hit. Once on the Oregon SHPO website homepage, which you can see here, locate the Document and Find section. Beneath it, you'll see Find an Historic Place. If you click on that, it will automatically launch the Oregon Historic Sites database. Once in the database, search under Group Name. Depending on your web browser and screen size, this screen may look slightly different to you. You can scroll down to select an MPD or previous survey. We selected Barns of Linn County, Oregon, 1846 to 1946, and then clicked Search. You can see that the original Barns of Linn County, Oregon MPD shows up, as well as properties that have been listed using that MPD. If you click on the Form button for an individual property, it will take you to the site information for the property. Under Groupings and Associations, you can see that it was listed in association with the Barns of Linn County, Oregon MPD. You can also click on the National Register or NR nomination link on the left-hand side of the screen to download the individual form. In addition to covering a range of property types, MPDs have fairly broad geographic distribution in Oregon. On this map, you can see communities highlighted and their number of individual listings associated with them. Unsurprisingly, Portland, as the state's largest city, has the most National Register listings associated with MPDs, with 115 listings, or 24% of all MPD-associated listings in the state. Understandably, the populated Willamette Valley also has a number of National Register listings associated with MPDs, but we do see listings in more rural communities like Enterprise, Wallowa, and Nisa, and along the coastline.
Oregon's MPDs cover a broad range of themes and time periods. The themes correspond to the National Register program's areas of significance. This slide illustrates not only the broad range of themes, but shows the frequency in which they're used, such as architecture, which is covered in 35 MPDs, community planning and development, covered in 21, and commerce in 15. The MPDs address these themes in varying degrees, some more thoroughly than others, providing both focused and broad historical context. For example, those MPDs focused on residential resources tend to highlight themes of architecture and community planning and development, while MPDs focused on commercial resources tend to highlight themes on commerce, architecture, and industry.
There are a number of MPDs that cross state boundaries, including historic residential suburbs in the United States from 1830 to 1960, United States Forest Service recreation facilities, public housing in the United States, and National Park Service Mission 66 era resources. The historic context of the Historic Residential Suburbs MPD covers the evolution of American suburbs from 1830 to 1960. It is a rich source of information about how suburbs have developed in our country and can be used for evaluating historic districts that are primarily residential in character. So residential neighborhoods that are outside of the city center but connected through one or more modes of transportation. The U.S. Forest Service Recreation Facilities MPD broadly addresses USFS recreation facilities on Forest Service land throughout the country. The Forest Service manages over 10,000 recreation facilities dating from 1905 to 1980. This MPD primarily focuses on structures and landscape features that were constructed within two major eras of investment in Forest Service recreation infrastructure: the Depression era from 1933 to 1942, and the Operation Outdoors era from 1957 to 1969. The historic context of the public housing in the United States MPD extends from 1933 until 1949 and addresses the political, social, and architectural trends that shaped the federal public housing program. This MPD provides the framework for analyzing and understanding the historic role and significance of individual public housing projects. While this MPD only applies to public housing projects, it is an important document for laying out the history of the program. The National Park Service Mission 66 Era Resources MPD provides the context for individual listing of buildings constructed within the National Park Service from 1945 through 1972. The Mission 66 program was the largest construction program in the history of the agency and was a noted shift towards the modern movement in a time when visitors flooded national parks after a period of rationing and travel restrictions during World War II. Similarly, there are several statewide MPDs which can be used throughout Oregon. For example, the MPD Black Historic Resources in Oregon 1788 to 2022 can be used statewide in areas where there is at least one historic resource related to Black history in Oregon over an incredibly long period, which means it covers a wide range of property types, including buildings, structures, sites, objects, and districts. Another example is the Oregon New Deal resources from the PWA and WPA, which focuses on public work relief projects of the Great Depression. Many Oregon communities have buildings associated with these New Deal programs, including post offices, courthouses, city halls, schools, libraries, etc. As of May 2025, there are 13 statewide MPDs in Oregon, which are listed on the screen.
In addition to the statewide MPDs, there are also several regional ones. That is, MPDs that are not contained just to a specific neighborhood or city, but have a larger geographic scope, just not the entire state. There are 8 regional MPDs in Oregon, which are listed on the screen. We're now going to highlight a few MPDs that demonstrate the range available in Oregon and that are ready to be used, whether that's to do more National Register listings or to reference their rich historic contexts for compliance or interpretive work. The first MPD we'll highlight is about the Oregon Trail, a 19th century emigrant wagon road stretching more than 2,000 miles from Missouri to Oregon's Willamette Valley. Although the old road traversed several states, the geographic scope of this MPD is limited to the trail corridor within Oregon. The MPD includes 4 historic contexts that discuss the geography, character, and setting of the road, its uses for exploration, transportation, and settlement, its social, political, and cultural significance, and finally, its economic and commercial significance. The MPD identifies 14 associated property types, ranging from road sections to river crossing points, and from trading posts to camping sites. This MPD is a great resource for both archaeologists and historians for its early settlement context as it relates to the trail. Beyond the scope of the Oregon Trail, the MPD is useful as a reference for understanding linear resources, how viewsheds and viewpoints relate to significance and eligibility, and for its information on early town development. The next MPD focuses on agricultural irrigation systems developed by the U.S. government in Oregon's arid and semi-arid lands. The Carry and Reclamation Act's MPD provides a framework for identifying and evaluating surviving irrigation systems that were developed between 1901 and 1978. It includes 2 historic contexts that are relevant to federal irrigation projects in central and eastern Oregon. It identifies 3 associated property types and several subtypes. Much like the Oregon Trail MPD, this one is useful to both archaeologists and historians who are investigating properties along and adjacent to the irrigation systems. It's also potentially useful to those investigating irrigation resources beyond the defined historic and geographic scopes of the MPD. And lastly, the MPD is an excellent reference document for anyone documenting communities impacted by irrigation.
Recently completed in 2022, this MPD covers the establishment and development of federal Depression era programs in Oregon, which were designed to provide work relief, construct infrastructure projects, and boost local economies. Specifically, the MPD covers properties associated with the Public Works Administration, or PWA, and the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. Although the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, was another vital New Deal program with many extant resources in Oregon associated with this program, the CCC resources and context will be dealt with in a future amendment. There are a range of property types included within this MPD, from government buildings like post offices, courthouses, city halls, and administration buildings, to public works facilities like water plants, sewage plants, and flood control, and even agricultural properties like fish hatcheries and fish farms. Other property types include schools, libraries, roads, tunnels, bridges, dams, military facilities, parks, lodges and cabins, scenic drives and trails, swimming pools and bathhouses, and even camps for the workers who built these other resources.
A good example of a county-wide document is the Craftsman Bungalows in Deschutes County MPD. Completed in 2000, this is a very approachable document. It could be useful for communities beyond Deschutes County. The structure and scope of the MPD is largely based on two historic resource surveys of Bend and Redmond completed in advance of the MPD. The historic context presents a broad development history of Deschutes County, but ultimately the focus is on craftsman bungalows, which are found in abundance there. The document identifies 7 property types that are based on common bungalow building forms found in Deschutes County. Although this MPD was approved in 2000, it has only 3 associated nominations, but is well positioned to facilitate future listings.
This recently completed MPD for historic resources associated with Black Oregonians provides an expansive history of African Americans in Oregon, beginning in 1788 and extending all the way until 2002. It is divided into 6 historic contexts or eras. Era 1 is exploration, expedition, and pre territorial government actions from 1788 to 1842. Era 2 is Black pioneers and government measures to exclude Black people from 1843 to 1867. Era 3 is anti Black state amidst a post emancipation nation from 1868 to 1919. Era 4 is the interwar years, the Great Depression, and the KKK from 1920 to 1941. Era 5 is World War II, War on Poverty, and the Civil Rights Movement from 1942 to 1969. And Era 6 is the recent Black Past from 1970 to 2002. As a statewide MPD with a rich context, this MPD can be used or referenced on a number of projects moving forward, from local survey and inventory work to National Register nominations.
We'd like to now shift and discuss how to create and use an MPD. The National Register of Historic Places program published guidance on MPDs in its Bulletin 16B, How to Complete the National Register Multiple Property Documentation Form. The bulletin was last updated in 1999, but the information is still relevant and useful. You can find it on the web simply by searching NR Bulletin 16B. In terms of creating or amending an MPD, it's best to familiarize yourself with Bulletin 16B and reach out to the SHPO staff to discuss the feasibility and possible scope of producing a new or amended document. It's important to note that producing an MPD is a longer and more intensive effort than drafting an individual nomination. The cornerstone of any MPD is survey data coupled with historical research, which together inform the MPD's geographic scope, time frame, property types, and registration requirement. So if there's no relevant survey data, or if it's outdated, the SHPO staff will likely suggest that you build into your plan the collection and analysis of survey data. We also suggest you identify a handful of properties to potentially nominate along with the new or amended MPD. When it comes to using an MPD to nominate a property or historic district, it's important to familiarize yourself with the subject property or properties to confirm they're a good fit with the MPD. Confirming this with SHPO staff is also a good idea before proceeding with completing a nomination form. Now, let's dig into the MPD form to better understand how it's organized. Unlike the National Register nomination form, which is organized into numbered sections 1 through 11, the multiple property documentation form is divided into lettered sections A through I. The first four sections, A, B, C, and D, are found on the cover page of the document, page 1 of the MPD. Section A is the name of the MPD. Section B lists the associated historic context used to produce the MPD. Section C lists the MPD authors and the date it was prepared. And finally, Section D provides the certification information that is completed by the SHPO and National Register staffs. The next 5 sections make up the bulk of the MPD form. Section E includes the long footnoted narratives that present the history, patterns, and trends that relate to and tie together the group of properties. Section F is where the group of properties are divided into property types that are defined by common characteristics. Section G provides the geographic boundaries of the area covered by the MPD. Section H is where the nomination preparer describes their research methods. And Section I is the bibliography of major sources used to produce the various parts of the MPD. So that's all the pieces of the MPD form. If you're submitting a new form, it must be accompanied by at least one individual nomination, together called a multiple property submission or a multiple property nomination. This associated nomination serves as a kind of proof of concept for the MPD.
Historic contexts provide information about the historical patterns and trends that produced individual properties. Historic contexts help us understand how a property fits into the broader story, and they serve as the foundation for decisions made about the identification, planning, and treatment of historic properties. There are many ways in which to look at historic properties, which means there are a number of ways of documenting historic contexts. The purpose or need for evaluating and managing historic properties can help determine the approach. While these can be tackled in several ways, there are 3 main approaches: thematic, geographic, and chronological. While a nominator may approach development of historic contexts in a thematic, geographic, and/or chronological way, all contexts must address these aspects in some way. MPDs have to have a geographic and temporal boundary, and associated property types must be related or linked by at least one thematic commonality. By type, so for example, bridges or bungalows, or by historic association, so for example, buildings by a particular architect or resources associated with Black history. For the thematic approach, a nominator could emphasize economic or political forces or even the role of specific groups in shaping a region's history. Architecture is often a theme that can be used to organize the historic context. However, care should be taken not to overly narrow the focus. For example, writing a historic context about duplexes will be overly specific, while one about apartment or multiple family type dwellings in general will be far more useful. A geographic approach looks at a specific geographic area. This can be a neighborhood, city, region, or even a state, And we see this approach in a number of MPDs that just apply to specific areas, like U.S. forest land or national parks.
Property types are outlined in Section F. A property type ties the historic context, presented in Section E, to specific resources so that National Register eligibility may be assessed. A property type is a grouping of resources defined by common physical attributes, such as architectural style, building or structural form, design, plan, method of construction, etc., or by associative attributes, like the property's relationship to important historical events, trends, people, cultural affiliations, etc. For example, earlier we featured the Craftsman Bungalows of Deschutes County MPD. Property types in this MPD are defined by physical attributes, namely the craftsman architectural style and the various bungalow forms. For an example of an MPD that has property types defined by associative qualities, see the Oregon New Deal resources from the TWA and the WPA, which organizes property types by their function and association with public work relief projects during the Great Depression. And finally, property type analysis is a tool for evaluating related resources. Using survey data to study the various examples of the property type yields important information that informs register eligibility. What results from this analysis is the registration requirements, which help determine what properties are eligible. Registration requirements are central to the MPD and also are found in Section F. They specify the attributes that a resource must possess, or the thresholds that it must meet, to be eligible for the National Register for its association with one or more of the MPD's historic contexts. Most MPDs include general registration requirements that apply to all the property types covered by the document, with additional specific requirements for each property type. The requirements typically discuss key physical characteristics, significant associative qualities, and integrity as they relate to the property type to help nomination preparers assess a resource's eligibility. Ultimately, the requirements help nomination preparers compare like resources and make informed judgments about a property's relative significance and eligibility. There are a few important takeaways regarding registration requirements and property types. First, because of this comparative analysis, registration requirements can help someone determine when a property is not eligible. Second, just because a resource fits within a defined property type does not mean it's automatically eligible. It must also meet the registration requirements and have documented significance related to the MPD themes. And finally, think of the first associated nomination submitted with the MPD as a kind of proof of concept that will demonstrate the feasibility of the registration requirements and property types. Cultural resource consultants will find MPDs useful for a variety of reasons. First, MPDs may be useful in nominating resources to the National Register. If you think a property may fit with an existing MPD, begin by confirming that the resource is within the geographic scope, noted in Section G, and matches with a property type, noted in Section F. If so, reach out to the SHPO staff to discuss the registration requirements for the property type and to confirm eligibility before preparing a nomination. A nomination preparer should use the MPD in a couple of ways: as a source of information to be referenced in the text like any other source, and also as a guide for justifying a property's eligibility under the registration requirements. Second, MPDs are useful in determining whether or not a resource is eligible for the National Register. For example, if your compliance reviews or historic resource surveys involve residential properties, there are several residential focused MPDs that offer excellent guidance on assessing integrity and determining eligibility. Even if the resource isn't within the MPD's geographic scope, thematically relevant MPDs can still provide useful context. See, for example, the Craftsman Bungalows of Deschutes County MPD. Although that document is specific to Craftsman Bungalows in Deschutes County, its bungalow-specific context could be referenced in connection with a bungalow anywhere in the state, or its countywide history could be used as a foundation for other Deschutes County properties. Third, MPDs are useful for historic preservation planning purposes because they evaluate properties on a comparative basis within a geographic area, and because this analysis can be used to help establish preservation priorities. And lastly, MPDs are rich with history and can be used as a reference for reports or nominations that aren't directly linked to the MPD, or for other historic resource needs, like interpretive projects. A nomination preparer may benefit from asking SHPO staff for a good example of a property nomination that is linked to an MPD. The sample nomination will illustrate how and where to reference MPD-related material. For example, the introductory paragraphs of Section 8 in the nomination form should state the name of the MPD, identify the associated property type, and explain how the nominated resource meets both the general and property type specific registration requirements. The preparer may find it useful to quote and cite relevant material from the historic contexts in Section E to supplement the property-specific history. Broad background context that's already presented in the MPD doesn't need to be fully reproduced in an individual property nomination. In most cases, a reference to the MPD's context, coupled with a streamlined summary of the most relevant portions, are sufficient. This allows the nomination's context to be shorter and more focused than it might have been if written without the benefit of an MPD. For example, a nomination for a lodge that's eligible under the MPD Oregon New Deal resources from the PWA and WPA should include a reference to the comprehensive background history of New Deal programs in Oregon, but it doesn't need to present a full historic context like it would if there was no associated MPD. Because the MPD has already done a lot of the work of establishing a significant historic context for Oregon's New Deal resources, the individual nomination would primarily focus on the history and development of the lodge itself.
Now that we've covered the various parts of an MPD and how to create, amend, and use an MPD, you may be considering how to include MPDs in your recommendations to clients. Creating or amending an MPD is a good pathway if there is a large number of related properties that share a common history, theme, or architectural style, and if the goal is to nominate these properties to the National Register or evaluate their significance for compliance purposes. This approach allows for more efficiency and consistency in evaluating, documenting, and justifying the eligibility of numerous related properties either simultaneously or over time. However, creating or amending an MPD may not be the best recommendation if little survey data is available to facilitate a comparative analysis of related properties, or if few National Register nominations or determinations of eligibility will result. In these cases, efforts may be better spent completing surveys and producing targeted historic contexts. It's worth reiterating that MPDs are not interchangeable with historic districts. So, if you're evaluating a concentration of resources in a defined area, like a neighborhood or commercial district, the best pathway toward nominating the collection of resources is as a historic district. Remember, MPDs are best suited for evaluating and nominating groups of thematically related properties, and they must be individually eligible for the National Register. Thank you for participating in this training. Hopefully, this has made you think about how MPDs in Oregon can assist you in your consulting work. This training is one deliverable from a project worked on by consultants Northwest Vernacular and Sarah J. Martin Cultural Resource Services to evaluate and encourage the use of multiple property documentation forms, or MPDs, in the state of Oregon.